The coffee mug slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor as David's voice drifted up from his home office below. I pressed myself against the wall at the top of our spiral staircase, heart hammering as his words registered with crystal clarity through the heating vent that connected our bedroom to his study. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The stairs are perfect, Brian. She always carries that heavy laundry basket up from the basement. One little push, maybe a loose carpet runner, and it'll look completely accidental. The insurance will pay out within 6 months, and by then, the audit trail will be cold. Brian Sullivan's gruff laugh made my stomach lurch. You sure about the timing? The life insurance policy is only 18 months old. Trust me, I've done the research. After the first year, they rarely investigate unless there's obvious foul play. Claire's always been clumsy anyway. Everyone will believe it. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor in our bedroom, the same room where David had whispered sweet promises just 3 years ago on our wedding night. The same man who now planned my murder with the casual tone he used to order his morning coffee. I'd known something was wrong for months. The late nights at Summit Financial Group had become more frequent. The phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The way his eyes had grown cold when he thought I wasn't watching. But murder? The word echoed in my mind as I sat there among the scattered pieces of my favorite mug, each shard reflecting fragments of the life I thought I knew. What David didn't realize, as he plotted my demise 2 floors below, was that his clumsy wife had spent the last 15 years as a forensic accountant, specializing in financial fraud. The same skills that had made me invaluable to law enforcement agencies across Colorado were about to become his worst nightmare. I remained frozen on the bedroom floor for what felt like hours, though the clock on our nightstand showed only 20 minutes had passed since my world imploded. David's voice had faded as he moved deeper into the house, probably to pour himself the celebratory scotch he always enjoyed after closing a big deal. Except this time, the deal was my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years I'd played the role of Claire Thompson, devoted wife and part-time bookkeeper for small local businesses. It was a comfortable fiction that allowed me to step back from the high-stress world of corporate investigations, while David built his career at Summit Financial Group. I'd met him at a charity fundraiser where I was listed simply as Claire Peterson, and when he asked what I did for work, I'd mentioned helping small businesses with their books. It wasn't technically a lie, just an incomplete truth. David had been charming then, attentive and ambitious in a way that felt refreshing after years of dating men intimidated by my career. He'd seemed genuinely interested in building a life together, talking about children and dream vacations and growing old on the porch of this very house. When he proposed, I'd been ready to embrace the simpler life he represented. Now, as I carefully gathered the pieces of shattered ceramic from our bedroom floor, I realized that my desire for normalcy had blinded me to who David really was. The signs had been there, subtle but persistent, like hairline cracks in a foundation that eventually bring down the entire structure. The phone calls that stopped when I appeared. The computer screen he'd snapped shut when I brought him coffee. The credit card statements that arrived at his office instead of our home. The business trips that seemed to require cash advances rather than company cards. Most telling of all, the gradual shift in how he spoke about his clients, from respect to casual contempt, as if they were nothing more than numbers in his personal ledger. I'd chalked it up to work stress, the pressure of managing wealthy portfolios in an uncertain market. After all, I'd seen plenty of financial professionals crack under similar pressure during my years investigating corporate fraud. But those investigations had also taught me to recognize the patterns, and David's behavior was starting to form a picture I didn't like. 3 months ago, I'd begun what I told myself was casual curiosity about his work. David often left his laptop open while he showered, and I'd started taking quick photos of his email screen with my phone. It was a violation of his privacy, but something in my gut insisted that our marriage was built on foundations less solid than I'd believed. What I discovered made my blood run cold. David wasn't just managing his clients' money. He was systematically skimming from their accounts. Small amounts at first, buried in management fees and administrative costs that most clients would never question. But as the months passed, the amounts grew bolder. Elderly clients were particularly vulnerable. Their adult children often too busy or trusting to scrutinize monthly statements carefully. The evidence was damning, but I'd hesitated to act on it. This was my husband, the man I'd promised to love and support. Part of me hoped I was misunderstanding the transactions, that there was some legitimate explanation for the patterns I was seeing. So I'd watched and documented, telling myself I was protecting both of us by gathering all the facts before making any accusations. Now, sitting in our bedroom with David's murder plot echoing in my ears, I understood the true scope of his desperation. He wasn't just stealing from clients. He was stealing enough to trigger serious federal charges when discovered. And based on his conversation with Brian, discovery was imminent. My death would solve multiple problems for David. The life insurance payout would give him the capital to replace the stolen funds before anyone noticed the discrepancies. My absence would eliminate the one person most likely to uncover his crimes, given my professional background. And as a grieving widower, he'd have the perfect cover story for any lifestyle changes needed to avoid suspicion. The plan was actually clever, in a sociopathic way. David had clearly studied my routines, noting that I carried heavy laundry baskets up from the basement every Tuesday and Friday evening. Our spiral staircase was steep, and I'd stumbled on it before when carrying bulky items. A loose carpet, runner, a subtle push at the right moment, and it would look like a tragic accident. The kind of thing that happened to busy wives every day across America. But David had made one critical error in his planning. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married, seeing only the simplified version of me I'd chosen to present. The real Claire Peterson Thompson had spent her career unraveling financial conspiracies far more complex than his amateur embezzlement scheme. And unlike his elderly clients, I knew exactly what signs to look for. I pulled myself to my feet and walked to our walk-in closet, moving aside the carefully organized shoes to reveal the small fireproof safe I'd installed shortly after we'd married. David knew about the safe, but he assumed it contained only our passports and insurance documents. He'd never bothered to look deeper. Inside, beneath the expected paperwork, was a manila folder containing 3 months of documentation on David's illegal activities. Bank records, email screenshots, transaction patterns, client account discrepancies, everything I'd gathered during my informal investigation. I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that marriage had made me suspicious of innocent business practices. Looking at the evidence now, I realized I'd been protecting David by staying silent. If I'd turned this information over to authorities 3 months ago, he'd be facing embezzlement charges instead of planning my murder. My misguided loyalty had escalated a financial crime into a conspiracy to commit murder. The folder also contained something else David didn't know about. A complete backup of his computer files from the night I'd discovered the full extent of his theft. I'd used a program from my forensic accounting days to create a mirror image of his hard drive, capturing not just the current files but also deleted data he'd thought was safely erased. Among those recovered files were email exchanges with Brian Sullivan that painted a picture of 2 men who'd been friends since college and partners in financial crime for almost as long. Brian worked as an insurance adjuster, which gave him inside knowledge of how claims were processed and investigated. Their correspondence revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths among David's elderly clients, each followed by insurance claims that Brian had personally expedited through the system. I'd been married to a serial killer, and I'd been too naive to see it. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt a familiar calm settling over my mind. It was the same mental state I'd entered during complex investigations, when emotions had to be set aside in favor of methodical analysis and strategic planning. David had made the mistake of viewing me as a victim, but victims were what other people became when they didn't fight back. I returned the folder to the safe and closed it carefully, my mind already working through the options available to me. I could call the police immediately, but David's conversation with Brian suggested they were planning to act soon. Without knowing the exact timing, I risked walking into a trap while trying to report it. I could confront David directly, but that would eliminate the advantage of him not knowing I was aware of his plans. Once he realized I'd overheard his conversation, he might accelerate his timeline or find a different method to silence me. The smartest move was to let David believe his plan was proceeding normally while I built an ironclad case against him. I had evidence of the embezzlement, but proving the murder conspiracy would require more careful documentation. I needed recorded conversations, additional witnesses, and most importantly, I needed to stay alive long enough to see justice done. But first, I had a role to play. David expected his clumsy, trusting wife to come downstairs soon, probably to start dinner preparations. He'd be watching for any signs that I suspected something, so my performance had to be flawless. I cleaned up the remaining pieces of the broken mug and changed into the comfortable clothes I typically wore for evening household tasks. In the bathroom mirror, I practiced the expression of mild contentment that David was accustomed to seeing. No trace of fear, anger, or suspicion could show on my face. As I headed toward the stairs, the same stairs David planned to use as a murder weapon, I felt a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. He'd spent months planning my death, but I was going to spend the next few days planning something far worse for him. Complete exposure and total destruction of everything he'd built on lies and stolen money. The first step was getting through dinner without arousing his suspicion. The second step was turning the tables so completely that by the time David realized what was happening, it would be far too late for him to stop it. After all, he wasn't the only one in this marriage who knew how to plan an accident. The kitchen felt different as I moved through the familiar motions of preparing dinner. Every knife in the wooden block seemed sharper, every surface harder, every shadow deeper. David's voice drifted from his office as he made another phone call, probably updating Brian on their timeline. I forced myself to focus on chopping vegetables for the stir-fry David had mentioned wanting earlier in the week, back when I'd thought his food preferences mattered. My hands remained steady as I worked, muscle memory taking over while my mind raced through calculations. The insurance policy David had mentioned was indeed 18 months old. I remembered him suggesting we increase our coverage when he'd gotten his promotion at Summit Financial Group. At the time, his reasoning had seemed practical. Higher income meant higher lifestyle expenses, so we needed more protection. Now I understood he'd been planning this for over a year. The sound of David's footsteps approaching the kitchen triggered my performance mode. I arranged my features into the pleasantly distracted expression I wore when cooking, humming softly, as I stirred the vegetables in the wok. When he appeared in the doorway, I looked up with the warm smile that had once been genuine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Something smells amazing," David said, moving behind me to plant a kiss on my neck. The same spot he'd kissed on our first date, when I'd thought his attention was romantic rather than calculated. Now his lips felt cold against my skin, and I had to suppress a shudder of revulsion. "Just that ginger stir-fry you mentioned?" I replied, leaning back against him as if his presence still brought me comfort. "How was your day? You seemed stressed when you got home." David's arms tightened around my waist, and for a moment I wondered if he could feel my heart racing. But when he spoke, his voice carried the same casual affection he'd been faking for months. "Just the usual client drama. You know how it is with these wealthy retirees. They panic every time the market fluctuates and want to micromanage their portfolios." He released me and moved to the refrigerator, pulling out a beer. "How about you? Get much done today?" The normalcy of the conversation felt surreal. Here was my husband, discussing his day as if he hadn't just finished planning my murder. I wondered how many of these casual exchanges had occurred while he'd been stealing from his clients. How many bedtime conversations had happened while he'd been plotting with Brian. The usual bookkeeping for Mrs. Chen's flower shop, I said, adding rice to our plates. Her numbers are finally starting to make sense after that computer upgrade. Amazing how much easier everything gets with proper software. It was a calculated comment. During my investigation into David's activities, I'd noticed his firm was still using outdated financial tracking systems. Either they were too cheap to upgrade, or someone wanted to maintain the kind of accounting opacity that made embezzlement easier to hide. Given what I now knew about David and Brian's partnership, I suspected the latter. David's slight pause as he opened his beer confirmed my suspicion. Yeah, some of those older systems can be real nightmares. We've been talking about upgrades at Summit, but you know how these corporate decisions drag on. I nodded sympathetically, while mentally noting that he'd just admitted his firm's systems were deliberately outdated. Another piece of evidence for the growing file I was building against him. We sat down to dinner, and David launched into what appeared to be a normal evening conversation about our weekend plans. He suggested we visit his mother on Saturday, then maybe catch a movie Sunday afternoon. The casual way he discussed our future, knowing he planned to end my life within days, revealed a level of sociopathy that made my skin crawl. But I played my part perfectly, agreeing to the weekend plans and asking about his mother's health. I even suggested we bring her those cookies she liked from the bakery downtown. David smiled and squeezed my hand across the table. The picture of a devoted husband making weekend plans with his beloved wife. The performance continued through dinner cleanup, with David drying dishes while I washed. He seemed more relaxed than he'd been in weeks, probably because his plan was finally in motion. I made mental notes of every detail, the way he kept checking. His phone, the slight spring in his step, the occasional humming that suggested genuine contentment. After we'd finished in the kitchen, David announced he had some work emails to catch up on and disappeared back into his office. I settled in the living room with a book, maintaining my usual evening routine while my mind worked furiously on the next phase of my own plan. The house grew quiet, except for the occasional murmur of David's voice as he made more calls. I strained to hear fragments of conversation, but he'd learned to keep his voice low during these evening sessions. No matter. I had other ways of gathering the information I needed. At 10 o'clock, I announced I was going to bed, calling out a casual goodnight toward David's office. He responded with an absent-minded acknowledgement, clearly distracted by whatever he was working on. Perfect. It would give me time to implement the next phase of my plan. In our bedroom, I changed into pajamas and went through the motions of my normal bedtime routine. But instead of getting into bed, I retrieved a small device from the back of my jewelry box. It was a digital voice recorder I'd purchased for legitimate work purposes months ago, but tonight it would serve a very different function. The heating vent that had allowed me to overhear David's conversation with Brian ran throughout the house, connecting most rooms through the old-fashioned ductwork. If I positioned the recorder correctly in the vent above our bedroom, it would capture any conversations taking place in David's office directly below. I climbed carefully onto a chair and removed the vent cover, placing the tiny recorder just inside the ductwork where it would be invisible but still pick up sound clearly. The device had a 12-hour battery life and voice activation technology, so it would automatically start recording whenever David began speaking. With the recorder in place, I settled into bed and forced myself to focus on the book I'd been reading, a thriller that now seemed tame compared to my real-life situation. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was reading about a fictional murder plot while lying in bed above my husband as he planned my actual death. Around midnight, I heard David's office door open and his footsteps on the stairs. I quickly turned off my reading light and pretended to be asleep, breathing slowly and evenly as he entered our bedroom. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to wake me, and I felt the bed dip as he settled beside me. For several minutes, David lay still, and I wondered if he was watching me sleep, perhaps rehearsing the story he'd tell police after my accident. The thought made my skin crawl, but I maintained my sleeping facade, occasionally shifting position as if lost in dreams. Eventually, David's breathing deepened into the pattern of genuine sleep. I waited another hour to be certain, then slipped quietly out of bed and padded downstairs in bare feet. His office door stood slightly ajar, just as he'd left it. Moonlight streaming through the windows provided enough illumination to navigate, without turning on lights. David's laptop sat open on his desk, screen dark but not fully shut down. I moved the mouse slightly, and the screen flickered to life, displaying his email inbox. My heart raced as I realized he hadn't logged out of his accounts. This was exactly the opportunity I'd been hoping for. I pulled out my phone and began photographing the screen, capturing email exchanges with Brian and several other contacts, whose names I didn't recognize. The communications painted a picture of a criminal network far more extensive than I'd initially realized. David wasn't just stealing from his own clients. He was part of a broader conspiracy involving multiple insurance adjusters, financial advisors, and what appeared to be at least one doctor who specialized in declaring deaths accidental. One email thread made my blood freeze. It contained detailed discussions of my daily routines, medical history, and even my childhood accident that had left me with a slight limp. They'd been studying me like a laboratory specimen, calculating the exact method of murder that would seem most believable given my personal history. But the most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Previous Successes. Inside were detailed files on 8 elderly clients who had died in apparent accidents over the past 3 years. Each death had been followed by substantial insurance, payouts that Brian had expedited through the system. The files contained medical records, insurance applications, and what appeared to be surveillance photos taken in the weeks before each death. I photographed everything, my hands shaking slightly as the full scope of their operation became clear. David wasn't just planning to kill me. He was an experienced serial killer who had been murdering vulnerable elderly people for years. The insurance money was apparently split between David, Brian, and their network of accomplices. My phone's camera captured page after page of evidence that would send all of them to prison for life. Bank account numbers, transaction records, detailed murder plans, and correspondence that revealed their complete lack of remorse for the lives they'd taken. They discussed their victims like business transactions, calculating profit margins and acceptable risk levels. One email from Brian particularly caught my attention. He'd written to David about a cleanup issue involving a victim's adult daughter, who was asking too many questions about her father's death. The solution they'd implemented involved discrediting the daughter's concerns by spreading rumors about her mental stability and drug use. The casual cruelty of destroying someone's reputation to cover up murder revealed the true depths of their sociopathy. As I scrolled through more files, I discovered they'd been using David's position at Summit Financial Group to identify potential victims. Elderly clients with substantial assets, minimal family oversight, and health issues that would make accidental death seem plausible were flagged in a separate database. They'd turned David's client list into a hunting ground for vulnerable prey. The planning documents for my own murder were terrifyingly detailed. They'd calculated the exact angle needed to make my fall down the stairs appear accidental, researched the typical injury patterns associated with such falls, and even planned David's emotional responses during the police investigation. He had a script prepared for every question investigators might ask. But their meticulous planning had created a fatal flaw. They'd documented everything. In their arrogance, they'd preserved evidence of multiple murders, ongoing criminal conspiracy, and detailed plans for future crimes. They'd essentially built their own prosecution case, probably never imagining that someone with my investigative background would gain access to their files. I spent 2 hours photographing evidence, my phone's memory filling with images that would destroy not just David and Brian, but their entire network of accomplices. When I'd captured everything visible on the laptop, I carefully restored the screen to exactly how I'd found it and crept back upstairs. David was still sleeping, peacefully, one arm stretched across the space where I'd been lying. Looking at him now, I saw not the charming man I'd married, but a cold-blooded killer who'd been sleeping beside me for 3 years while planning the deaths of innocent people. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, not just of our marriage, vows, but of every fundamental assumption I'd made about human nature and my ability to judge character. Back in bed, I stared at the ceiling while my mind processed everything I'd discovered. The evidence I'd gathered was more than sufficient to convict David and his accomplices of multiple murders. But simply turning it over to police would mean trusting a system that had failed to detect their crimes for years. Given Brian's position as an insurance adjuster and their network of corrupt medical professionals, I couldn't be certain how deep their influence extended. No, this situation required a more strategic approach. I needed to ensure that every member of their network was exposed simultaneously, giving none of them the opportunity to destroy evidence or escape justice. That meant careful coordination and perfect timing. I also needed to stay alive long enough to see them all arrested. David's plan to push me down the stairs was clearly imminent, probably within the next few days based on his conversation with Brian. I had to find a way to turn their own scheme against them while building an airtight case that would survive any legal challenges. As dawn approached, I finally drifted into a light sleep, my dreams filled with images of elderly victims who died believing their financial advisor was someone they could trust. By tomorrow evening, I would begin the process of getting justice for all of them. David thought he was planning my accident, but I was planning something far more devastating: the complete destruction of his entire criminal empire. The prey was about to become the predator, and David had no idea what kind of hunter he'd been living with all these years. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. David woke up cheerful, humming in the shower while I prepared his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and coffee. I watched him butter his toast, the same hands that had typed detailed murder plans now performing the mundane task of spreading jam. The disconnect between his domestic facade and his true nature still left me reeling. "I might be late tonight," David mentioned casually, checking his phone between bites. "Brian and I need to finalize some paperwork for the Henderson account." Henderson. I recognized the name from the files I'd photographed. Margaret Henderson, 73 years old, recent widow with a substantial pension and minimal family contact. According to David's notes, she'd been flagged as their next target after me. The casual way he mentioned her name while planning multiple murders made my stomach turn. "Of course, honey," I replied, refilling his coffee cup. "I'll probably just have a quiet evening at home. Maybe catch up on some reading." David smiled and squeezed my hand. "You're so understanding, Claire. I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony was suffocating. Here was my husband, expressing gratitude for my support while actively planning to kill me within days. I wondered if this was how all psychopaths operated, compartmentalizing their crimes so completely that they could genuinely feel affection for their intended victims. After David left for work, I immediately retrieved the voice recorder from the heating vent. The device had captured nearly 6 hours of conversation from his office the night before, including several phone calls I'd missed while photographing his computer files. I connected the recorder to my laptop and began transcribing the most incriminating portions. The first conversation was with Brian, discussing final preparations for what they called the Claire Project. They'd decided to implement their plan this Friday evening when I'd be carrying laundry up from the basement as usual. Brian would be waiting in his car nearby, ready to respond as the concerned friend who'd come to check on David when he didn't show up for their planned dinner. "Remember, you need to wait at least 20 minutes before calling 911, Brian's voice instructed through the recording. "Give her time to settle, and make sure you sound genuinely panicked when you call." Practice it a few times. David's response chilled me to the bone. I've been practicing for weeks. The key is to let real emotion come through. I'll be thinking about losing everything if this doesn't work. They discussed their timeline in clinical detail. David would suggest I start a load of laundry around 7 o'clock Friday evening. While I was downstairs, he'd loosen the carpet runner on the stairs and wait for me to return with the heavy basket. A quick push at the right moment and I'd tumble down the spiral staircase with enough force to cause fatal injuries. Brian would arrive 15 minutes later, as if coming for their dinner plans, and would discover David attempting to revive me. He'd take charge of the scene, ensuring that any evidence of foul play was either removed or explained away. As an insurance adjuster, Brian knew exactly what investigators would look for and how to misdirect their attention. The second phone call on the recording was even more disturbing. David had contacted someone he called Dr. Marcus, who was apparently the medical professional responsible for declaring their victims' deaths accidental. Dr. Marcus would be on call Friday evening, ready to respond when the ambulance was called. The beauty of head trauma, Dr. Marcus explained in a voice that sounded disturbingly cheerful, is that it can mask other injuries. Even if there are defensive wounds or signs of struggle, severe head injuries from a fall make everything else look secondary. They discussed my medical history in detail, including the childhood accident that had left me with a slight limp. Dr. Marcus suggested that my previous injury would make the fall seem more plausible, since I already had a documented history of mobility issues. "What about the husband?" Dr. Marcus asked. "How's his acting ability?" "David's got it down to an art form," Brian replied. "He's been playing the devoted husband for 3 years. A few tears and some genuine shock should be enough." The casual way they discussed my murder, as if I were merely another business transaction, crystallized my resolve. These men had spent years perfecting their system, killing vulnerable people, for profit, while hiding behind facades of respectability. They thought they were untouchable, protected by their professional positions and carefully constructed alibis. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The third conversation captured on the recorder involved David calling someone named Tommy, who appeared to be responsible for disposing of evidence after their crimes. Tommy's job was to ensure that any physical evidence of foul play disappeared before investigators could discover it. "Same protocol as always," David instructed. "Clean sweep of the house after the scene is processed. Any computers, phones, or documents that might raise questions need to vanish." "What about her business files?" Tommy asked. "The bookkeeping stuff?" "Everything goes. We can't risk anyone finding connections between her work and our clients." This confirmed my suspicion that they viewed my forensic accounting background as a potential threat, even though they didn't realize I'd already discovered their crimes. They planned to eliminate any evidence that might lead investigators to question their official narrative. But their paranoia about my professional skills had led them to overlook something crucial. I'd been building my own evidence file for months, stored in locations they knew nothing about. While they planned to erase my digital footprint, they had no idea about the backup drives hidden in my sister Amy's house, or the detailed notes I'd been sending to an encrypted email account they couldn't access. The final conversation on the recording was David talking to himself, rehearsing his emotional responses for the police investigation. I listened in horrified fascination as my husband practiced crying on command, working out the exact words he'd used to describe finding my body. "She was just lying there at the bottom of the stairs," he repeated several times, adjusting his tone until it sounded appropriately devastated. I kept calling her name, but she wouldn't respond. "There was so much blood." He practiced answers to anticipated questions about our marriage, his whereabouts during my fall, and his knowledge of any enemies I might have had. Every response was carefully crafted to deflect suspicion while painting himself as the grieving husband devastated by a tragic accident. The level of preparation was both impressive and terrifying. David had thought through every possible angle, anticipated every question investigators might ask, and prepared responses that would direct attention away from the truth. If I hadn't discovered his plan, there's no doubt he would have gotten away with my murder just as he'd gotten away with killing 8 elderly victims. But David's meticulous planning contained a fatal flaw. He'd underestimated his target. While he'd been rehearsing his role as the grief-stricken widower, I'd been gathering evidence that would expose his entire criminal network. His preparations for my death would become the foundation for his own destruction. With the recorded conversations transcribed and added to my growing evidence file, I turned my attention to the next phase of my plan. I needed to alert law enforcement in a way that would ensure all members of the network were arrested simultaneously. A single phone call to local police wouldn't be sufficient. This required federal coordination to prevent any of the conspirators from escaping justice. I spent the morning researching the appropriate federal agencies to contact. The FBI would handle the criminal conspiracy and murder charges. The SEC would investigate the financial fraud and embezzlement. The Insurance Commission would examine Brian's role in expediting fraudulent claims. Each agency would need different pieces of evidence to build their cases. More importantly, I needed to ensure my own safety while the investigation unfolded. David's plan to kill me Friday evening was still active, and I couldn't simply disappear without triggering his suspicions. I had to let him believe everything was proceeding normally, while secretly coordinating with law enforcement to catch him in the act. The solution came to me as I reviewed the timeline David and Brian had discussed. They expected me to be carrying laundry up from the basement at 7 o'clock Friday evening. What if I was, but with federal agents positioned throughout the house, to witness David's attempted murder? They could arrest him in the act while simultaneously raiding Brian's home, Dr. Marcus's office, and Tommy's base of operations. But first, I needed to make contact with the right people. I couldn't use my home phone or computer, since David might have installed monitoring software. Instead, I drove to the public library downtown and used their computers to research FBI field offices in Colorado. The Denver field office seemed like the best starting point. I composed a detailed email explaining the situation and attached selected pieces of evidence, enough to prove I was serious, but not so much that they'd dismiss me as a crank. I provided my sister Amy's phone number as a contact point, asking them to use a code phrase so I'd know the communication was legitimate. The email was sent from a temporary account I created using a false name and Amy's address. Within hours, my sister called to report that an FBI agent had contacted her using the exact code phrase I'd specified. They wanted to meet with me immediately. The meeting was arranged for that afternoon at a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, far enough from Millbrook Heights that David wouldn't accidentally encounter us. I drove there in a roundabout route, checking my mirrors constantly to ensure I wasn't being followed. Agent Lisa Park was younger than I'd expected, with short dark hair and an intensity that reminded me of my own focus during complex investigations. She was accompanied by Agent Robert Chen from the Financial Crimes Division and Agent Sandra Williams, who specialized in organized criminal conspiracies. "Mrs. Thompson," Agent Park began after we'd settled at a corner table away from other customers, "what you've described in your email suggests a criminal conspiracy of significant scope. We need to verify your evidence and understand the full extent of the operation." I handed them an encrypted flash drive containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. "Everything's there: financial records, email communications, recorded conversations, victim profiles, and detailed plans for multiple murders, including my own." Agent Chen plugged the drive into a secure laptop and began reviewing the files. His expression grew increasingly grim as he scrolled through David's communications with Brian and their network of accomplices. "This is extensive," he murmured, looking up from the screen. "How long have you been gathering this information?" 3 months of active investigation," I replied. "But I've been noticing suspicious patterns for almost a year. My background is in forensic accounting, so I recognize the signs of financial fraud in my husband's work." Agent Williams leaned forward. You mentioned in your email that they're planning to kill you this Friday. Walk us through their timeline. I described everything I'd learned from the recorded conversations, including the specific timing of David's plan and the roles each conspirator would play. The agents took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about locations and procedures. We'll need to coordinate with multiple agencies, Agent Park explained. This involves federal crimes across several jurisdictions. The insurance fraud alone requires coordination with state regulators. How long will that take? I asked, thinking about Friday's rapidly approaching deadline. We can have task force assembled by tomorrow morning, Agent Chen assured me. But we need your cooperation to make this work. You'll have to maintain your normal routine while we prepare the operation. The thought of returning home to David, knowing what he was planning, made my skin crawl. But I understood the necessity. Any deviation from my usual behavior might alert him that his plan had been discovered. There's something else, I said, pulling out a second flash drive. I've identified 8 previous victims of their network, elderly clients who died in suspicious accidents over the past 3 years. Their families deserve to know the truth. Agent Williams accepted the drive with a solemn expression. We'll investigate every case. If these people were murdered, their families will get justice. We spent another hour discussing operational details. The FBI would position surveillance teams around our house and Brian's location. When David made his move Friday evening, they'd have everything on video. Simultaneous raids would arrest all known members of the network before any of them could destroy evidence or flee. One more thing, Agent Park said as we prepared to leave. You mentioned that your husband doesn't know about your forensic accounting background. That suggests he's underestimated your capabilities from the beginning. I nodded, thinking about all the times David had dismissed my intelligence or treated my work as merely bookkeeping for small businesses. His sexist assumptions had blinded him to the fact that he'd married someone perfectly equipped to uncover his crimes. He sees what he expects to see, I replied. A devoted wife who's grateful for his financial support. He never bothered to learn who I really am. Agent Park smiled grimly. That's going to be his downfall. Men like your husband always underestimate the women in their lives. It's their greatest weakness. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. The investigation was now in motion, with federal agents coordinating a takedown that would expose David's entire criminal network. Justice was coming for all the victims who'd been killed by these monsters hiding behind professional facades. But first, I had to survive until Friday evening. David would be watching me carefully over the next 2 days, looking for any signs that I suspected his plan. My performance as the unsuspecting wife would have to be flawless. When I arrived home, David was already there, sitting in his office with the door open. He looked up as I entered, his expression warm and welcoming. If I hadn't known what he was planning, I might have been fooled by his apparent affection. "How was your day?" he asked, standing to give me a hug. "Good," I replied, melting into his embrace as if I still found comfort there. "Just ran some errands. The usual Thursday routine." David held me a moment longer than necessary, and I wondered if he was savoring what he thought would be one of our last normal conversations. The thought made me feel sick, but I maintained my facade of contentment. "Brian called," David mentioned casually. "We confirmed our dinner plans for Friday. You don't mind eating alone, do you?" "Of course not," I said, though my heart rate spiked at the mention of Friday. "I'll probably just have something light and catch up on reading." David smiled and kissed my forehead. "You're so understanding, sweetheart. I don't deserve you." For once, his words carried an accuracy he didn't intend. He truly didn't deserve me, or any of the trust I'd placed in him during our marriage. But by Friday evening, that betrayal would finally be answered with justice. I just had to stay alive long enough to see it happen. Friday morning dawned gray, and drizzling, the kind of weather that made everything feel ominous. I woke to find David already dressed for work, standing at our bedroom window with his coffee cup. He seemed unusually contemplative, perhaps reflecting on the fact that this would be our last morning together. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to maintain my routine. "Early meeting today?" I asked, stretching as if I'd just awakened naturally. David turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Just wanted to get a head start on things. Big day ahead." The understatement was almost laughable, while David was preparing for what he thought would be my murder. Federal agents were finalizing their plans to arrest his entire criminal network. I wondered if he had any intuition that today would end with him in handcuffs, rather than me in a morgue. I made breakfast while David showered, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Every mundane action felt surreal, like performing in a play where only I knew the script would change dramatically before the final act. The eggs I scrambled, the coffee I poured, the toast I buttered, all of it was happening for the last time in this house where I'd been living with a monster. David appeared in the kitchen freshly shaved and dressed in his best suit. For a moment, I wondered if he'd chosen his attire carefully for the police interviews that would follow my supposed accident. Image management was clearly important to him, even when planning murder. "You look nice," I commented, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. "Thanks. Important client meeting today." He sat down to eat, checking his phone frequently. I recognized the nervous energy that preceded his major crimes, though he was trying to hide it behind casual conversation. "Will you be home for lunch?" I asked, knowing the answer but maintaining the pretense of a normal day. "Probably not. Things might run long." David paused between bites, studying my face. "You seemed different today. Everything okay?" My heart skipped, but I kept my expression neutral. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well. Too much rain on the roof." David nodded, apparently satisfied with my explanation. But I noticed him watching me more carefully as he finished breakfast, probably looking for any signs that I suspected his plan. His paranoia was showing despite his attempts to appear relaxed. After David left for work, I spent the morning in careful preparation for the evening ahead. Agent Park had called my sister's phone with a coded message confirming that surveillance teams were already in position around our neighborhood. They'd been watching David since early morning, documenting his movements and communications. I packed a small overnight bag and hid it in my car's trunk, containing essentials I'd need if I couldn't return home immediately after David's arrest. The FBI had warned me that our house would become a crime scene, potentially sealed for days while they processed evidence. More challenging was maintaining my usual Friday routine while knowing what was coming. I cleaned the house as I normally would, did some bookkeeping work for Mrs. Chen's flower shop, and even started a pot roast in the slow cooker for the dinner David and I would never share. At 3 o'clock, my sister Amy called with another coded message from Agent Park. David had met with Brian at Summit Financial Group, and their conversation had been recorded through surveillance equipment. They'd confirmed tonight's timeline and discussed final preparations. Dr. Marcus was on standby, and Tommy had been positioned to clean up evidence after my supposed accident. The net was closing around all of them simultaneously. While David thought he was implementing the perfect crime, federal agents were documenting every aspect of the conspiracy. By evening, they'd have enough evidence to convict the entire network. But first, David had to attempt the murder. The FBI needed him to make the actual move against me, so they could arrest him for attempted murder rather than just conspiracy. It was a calculated risk that required perfect timing and coordination. Around 5 o'clock, David called to confirm he'd be home by 6:30. His voice sounded forced, cheerful, like someone trying too hard to appear normal. I wondered if he was rehearsing his emotional responses for the police interviews he expected to give later. "Don't wait dinner for me," he said. Brian and I will grab something after we finish our business. Business. The casual euphemism for planning my murder. Made my stomach turn, but I kept my voice light. No problem. I'll probably just have some soup and watch a movie. Perfect. Love you, sweetheart. The words felt like a slap. How could someone claim to love another person while actively planning their death? I supposed sociopaths were capable of compartmentalizing their emotions in ways that normal people couldn't understand. I spent the next hour and a half in final preparations. The laundry basket was loaded with clean clothes that needed to be carried upstairs, just as David expected. But hidden among the towels and sheets was a small recording device that would capture everything he said during the attack. At 6:15, I received a text message that appeared to be from my sister, but contained a coded phrase from Agent Park. Surveillance teams were in position throughout the house and surrounding area. Agents were hidden in our basement, garage, and the vacant house across the street. Others were positioned near Brian's location and Dr. Marcus's office, ready to make simultaneous arrests. David arrived home at exactly 6:30, earlier than usual but perfectly on schedule for his planned timeline. He seemed energetic and focused, like someone preparing for an important business presentation. I suppose in his mind, murder was just another form of transaction. "How was your day?" I asked as he hung up his coat. "Productive. Very productive." David moved to the kitchen window, glancing out at the darkening sky. "Looks like the rain's stopped. Good evening for staying." Sure, I nodded, though I noticed him checking his phone again. Probably coordinating with Brian, who should be driving toward our house right now to establish his alibi as the concerned friend arriving for dinner. "I should get that laundry upstairs before it wrinkles," I mentioned casually, moving toward the basement door. "The load's been sitting in the dryer all afternoon." David's head snapped up, his expression sharpening with interest. "Need any help? That basket gets pretty heavy." "I can manage," I replied, though my heart was racing. "It's just towels and sheets. Nothing too bad." I descended into the basement, knowing that Agent Williams was hidden behind the storage shelves near the furnace. She'd be recording everything that happened, providing backup documentation in case the main surveillance equipment failed. The basement felt different, knowing I wasn't alone down there. While I loaded the laundry basket, I could sense the agent's presence even though I couldn't see her. It was oddly comforting to know that someone was watching out for me as I walked into David's trap. I hefted the basket, making sure it was heavy enough to support David's narrative about my losing balance on the stairs. The weight would make my supposed fall seem more plausible, while also providing cover for the recording equipment hidden among the linens. As I climbed the basement stairs, I could hear David moving around in the kitchen above. He was probably loosening the carpet runner on the main staircase, preparing the scene for my accident. The thought that my husband was actively setting a trap to kill me still felt surreal, despite everything I'd learned about his true nature. I emerged from the basement to find David standing near the bottom of our spiral staircase, apparently adjusting something on the steps. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of anticipation and forced concern. "Let me help you with that," he offered, reaching for the laundry basket. "I've got it," I insisted, maintaining my usual independent streak. David had always complained about my insistence on doing things myself, never realizing that my self-reliance came from years of living alone before our marriage. I started up the stairs, acutely aware of David following close behind me. According to his plan, he would push me when I reached the 7th step, where the curve of the spiral staircase would make my fall look most natural. The loose carpet runner would provide additional explanation for why I'd lost my footing. As I climbed, I could feel David's presence just behind me, could almost sense him calculating the perfect moment to strike. My grip on the laundry basket tightened as I reached the 5th step, then the 6th. On the 7th step, I felt David's hands against my back. But instead of the violent shove I'd expected, his touch was almost gentle. as if he was having second thoughts. For a moment, I wondered if some buried part of his conscience was fighting against his murderous intentions. Then his hands pressed, harder, and I realized he was just gathering his nerve. The push, when it came, was surprisingly forceful. David had clearly calculated the exact amount of pressure needed to send me tumbling down the stairs with potentially fatal injuries. But what he hadn't calculated was that I was ready for it. Instead of trying to maintain my balance, I dropped the laundry basket and grabbed the handrail with both hands, letting my body swing sideways away from the stairs. The basket tumbled down ahead of me, creating the sound effects David expected, while I caught myself on the rail and landed safely on the 6th step. "Claire!" David's voice carried perfectly rehearsed panic as he rushed down toward me. "Oh my God, are you okay? Don't move. You might be hurt." I lay still on the stairs, letting David believe his plan had worked. Through half-closed eyes, I could see him pulling out his phone, probably to call Brian and confirm that the accident had occurred as planned. But before David could make his call, the front door burst open and Agent Park strode into our foyer with her weapon drawn. "FBI! David Thompson, you're under arrest for attempted murder!" David's face went white as more agents poured through the door. His phone clattered to the floor as he raised his hands, the rehearsed grief replaced by genuine shock and terror. "What? I don't understand. My wife fell down the stairs. I was trying to help her." Agent Park smiled grimly as she approached him with handcuffs. "We have the entire incident on video, Mr. Thompson. We watched you push your wife down these stairs. We also have recordings of your conversations planning this murder." As Agent Park read David his rights, other agents were securing the scene and gathering evidence. The loose carpet runner David had arranged was photographed and tagged. The laundry basket was examined for the recording equipment hidden inside. I sat up on the stairs, brushing off David's attempts to maintain his innocent facade. "It's over, David. They know everything. About the embezzlement, the insurance fraud, the murders of your elderly clients. All of it." David's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to pure hatred as he realized the full extent of his situation. "You bitch. You've been spying on me." "I've been investigating you," I corrected. "Just like I investigated financial criminals for 15 years before we met. You might have done some research on my childhood accident, but you never bothered to learn what I did for a living." Agent Park's radio crackled with updates from other teams. Brian had been arrested at his location, caught with equipment intended to stage my accident scene. Dr. Marcus had been taken into custody at his office, where agents had found files on all the previous victims. Tommy was in handcuffs at his apartment, surrounded by evidence from multiple crime scenes. "How?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You documented everything," I explained as agents led him toward the door. "Every email, every phone call, every murder plan. You were so confident in your system that you preserved evidence of your own crimes." David's legs seemed to give out as the full reality hit him. His perfect plan hadn't just failed. It had become the foundation for his own destruction. The careful documentation he'd thought would protect him from mistakes had instead provided law enforcement with everything they needed to convict him and his entire network. As the agents escorted David from our house, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. Relief that I'd survived his murder attempt. Sadness for the marriage that had been built on lies from the beginning. And vindication for all the victims who would finally receive justice. But mostly, I felt grateful for the investigative skills that had allowed me to uncover David's crimes before he could claim any more victims. Margaret Henderson would live to see another birthday because I'd recognized the patterns in time to stop them. Agent Williams emerged from the basement, carrying recording equipment that had captured David's attempted murder from multiple angles. "Perfect evidence," she reported to Agent Park. "Jury's going to love this one." I stood up from the stairs. Where my husband had tried to kill me, brushing dust from my clothes and preparing to give my statement to the FBI. Outside, I could see news vans already arriving as word of the arrests spread through the neighborhood. Tomorrow, the story would be national news. How a wife's discovery of her husband's embezzlement had led to exposing a multi-state murder conspiracy. But tonight, justice was finally being served for 8 elderly victims who'd died trusting their financial advisor, and one wife who'd refused to become the 9th victim. The prey had indeed become the predator, and David's carefully planned accident had become his complete downfall. 6 months later, I stood in the witness box of the federal courthouse in Denver, looking directly at David as I testified about the night he tried to murder me. He sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits replaced by prison attire, his confident demeanor shattered by months of solitary confinement and mounting evidence against him. The courtroom was packed with families of David's victims, elderly relatives who had traveled from across the country to see justice served for their murdered loved ones. Margaret Henderson sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she realized how close she'd come to becoming victim number 9. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor continued, "please tell the court what happened when you reached the 7th step." I described the moment David pushed me, the calculated force behind his hands, the way he'd immediately switched to his rehearsed panic when he thought I was injured. The jury listened with rapt attention, several members shaking their heads, in disgust as I recounted my husband's attempt to kill me in our own home. The evidence against David and his network was overwhelming. Agent Park had testified earlier about the surveillance footage that captured the attempted murder from multiple angles. Agent Chen had walked the jury through the financial records showing years of systematic embezzlement. Agent Williams had presented the communications between all the conspirators, their casual discussions of murder played back in their own voices. But the most damaging testimony had come from Dr. Marcus, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He'd described in clinical detail how he'd helped cover up 8 murders, falsifying death certificates and misdirecting investigations to protect David and Brian's operation. Brian himself had refused to cooperate, maintaining his innocence, even as recordings of his conversations with David played in court. His lawyer had attempted to argue that the surveillance was illegally obtained, but the FBI's careful coordination with federal prosecutors had ensured every piece of evidence was admissible. Tommy had been the first to break, providing detailed information about how the network disposed of evidence after each murder. His testimony had led investigators to recover physical evidence from several crime scenes that had previously been ruled accidental deaths. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, with each day bringing new revelations about the scope of David's criminal enterprise. What had started as embezzlement from elderly clients had evolved into a systematic murder operation that spanned multiple states and involved corrupt professionals in finance, insurance, and medicine. David's defense attorney had tried various strategies to explain away the evidence. He'd argued that the recordings were taken out of context, that David's discussions of murder were merely hypothetical scenarios, that the financial irregularities were clerical errors rather than deliberate theft. But the prosecution had methodically demolished each attempt at creating reasonable doubt. The evidence was simply too extensive, too detailed, and too well coordinated to be anything other than proof of a premeditated criminal conspiracy. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor asked, "how do you feel about your husband's claim that he was trying to help you when you fell on the stairs?" I looked directly at David as I answered. "My husband spent months planning to murder me for insurance money. He researched the exact method that would cause fatal injuries while appearing accidental. He coordinated with accomplices to cover up his crime. He practiced his emotional responses for the police investigation he expected to follow my death. There was nothing helpful about pushing me down a staircase." David's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. The jury had already heard all of this evidence in excruciating detail. My testimony was simply confirming what the surveillance, footage and recorded conversations had already proven beyond any doubt. The defense's closing argument was a desperate attempt to portray David as a man driven to desperation by gambling debts and alcohol abuse. His lawyer painted him as someone who had made terrible decisions, but wasn't truly a cold-blooded killer. The prosecution's closing was devastating in its simplicity. They played excerpts from David's recorded conversations, letting his own words condemn him. His casual discussion of my murder, his detailed planning of previous victims' deaths, his complete lack of remorse for the lives he'd taken or planned to take. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: murder conspiracy, attempted murder, insurance fraud, embezzlement, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. David's face remained expressionless as the verdicts were read, but I could see his hands shaking as he realized the full magnitude of his situation. Brian received similar verdicts, as did the other conspirators who'd gone to trial. Dr. Marcus's cooperation had earned him a reduced sentence, but he still faced decades in federal prison for his role in covering up 8 murders. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. I chose not to attend, having said everything I needed to say during the trial. But Amy called me that evening to report that David had received life in prison without the possibility of parole, as had Brian. The judge had called their crimes a calculated betrayal of the trust that elderly Americans place in financial professionals. More importantly, the investigation David's arrest had triggered led to broader reforms in how insurance claims were processed and how financial advisors' activities were monitored. The regulatory gaps that had allowed David's network to operate for years were systematically closed, making it much harder for similar conspiracies to develop in the future. Margaret Henderson had become something of an activist for elderly financial protection, speaking at conferences about the warning signs of predatory financial advisors. She often mentioned how close she'd come to becoming a victim, and how one woman's courage to investigate her own husband had saved countless other lives. The insurance settlement from David's own policy was substantial, though it felt strange to profit from a man's attempt to murder me. I donated most of the money to organizations that protected vulnerable elderly adults from financial abuse, keeping only enough to rebuild my life away from the shadow of David's crimes. I'd moved out of our house in Millbrook Heights the day after David's arrest. Being in that place where he'd planned my murder felt poisonous, even after the FBI finished processing it as a crime scene. Amy had helped me pack my belongings, and I'd never returned to see the place again. My new home was a small cottage on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, far enough from Millbrook Heights to feel like a fresh start, but close enough to maintain my professional relationships. I'd returned to forensic accounting full-time, specializing in cases involving financial abuse of elderly victims. The skills that had saved my life were now helping other families recover stolen assets and hold predatory financial advisors accountable. I'd become something of an expert in recognizing the patterns David's network had used, helping law enforcement agencies across the country identify similar operations before they could claim more victims. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply satisfying. Every case I solved, every dollar I recovered for victimized families felt like another small victory against the kind of evil David had represented. I was turning his betrayal into something that protected other people from experiencing what I'd endured. My relationship with Amy had grown stronger through the ordeal. She'd been my lifeline during the darkest moments, providing emotional support and practical help as I rebuilt my life. Having someone who knew the complete truth about what I'd experienced was invaluable for processing the trauma of discovering that my husband was a serial killer who'd planned my murder. I'd also stayed in touch with several of the FBI agents who'd worked on the case. Agent Park had become something of a friend, occasionally consulting with me on other financial crime investigations. She often said that my case had been the most satisfying of her career, since it had not only stopped an active killer, but had led to justice for so many previous victims. The media attention had been intense but mercifully brief. The story of the forensic accountant who uncovered her husband's murder conspiracy had dominated news cycles for a few weeks, but public interest eventually moved on to other scandals. I'd given a few interviews to help raise awareness about financial elder abuse, but mostly I preferred to let my work speak for itself. Dating again felt impossible, and I wasn't sure it ever would. The betrayal of discovering that someone I'd loved and trusted had been planning to kill me had damaged my ability to trust romantic partners in ways that might never fully heal. Perhaps someday I'd be ready to risk my heart again, but for now, I was content to focus on my work and the relationships with family and friends that had sustained me through the crisis. The divorce had been finalized while David was awaiting trial, though it felt like a formality since our marriage had essentially ended the moment I overheard his murder plans. I'd kept his last name for professional reasons, since my reputation in forensic accounting was built under the name Claire Thompson, but I'd legally restored my maiden name as my middle name, reclaiming the identity that existed before David had entered my life. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't overheard that conversation, if David's plan had proceeded as intended. Would I have sensed the danger in time to protect myself? Would the FBI have eventually uncovered his network through other means? Or would I have become just another tragic accident, another elderly client whose death was explained away by corrupt professionals? The thought still gave me nightmares occasionally, but therapy had helped me process the trauma of surviving a murder attempt by someone I'd loved. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my therapist, had specialized in helping victims of domestic violence, though she said my case was unique in her experience. Most domestic violence escalates gradually, she'd explained during one of our sessions. What you experienced was more like discovering you'd been living with a stranger who happened to be a serial killer. The betrayal trauma is compounded by the revelation that nothing about your relationship was genuine. The healing process had been slow but steady. I'd learned to trust my instincts again, to recognize that my investigative skills had literally saved my life. The same analytical abilities that had attracted David's suspicion had ultimately been his downfall. I'd also learned to separate my identity from my marriage to David. For 3 years, I'd defined myself partly as his wife, adapting my personality and ambitions to fit his vision of what our life together should be. Reclaiming my full professional identity had been liberating, in ways I hadn't expected. The cottage I'd bought came with a small home office where I could work on my most sensitive cases. The space was nothing like David's elaborate setup in our Millbrook Heights house, but it felt genuinely mine in a way that shared space never had. I decorated it with photos from my forensic accounting career, reminders of the professional accomplishments that predated my marriage. Mrs. Chen's flower shop had been one of my first clients after I'd resumed full-time practice. She'd been devastated to learn about David's crimes, having always thought him charming during the few times they'd met. But she'd also been proud that her bookkeeper had been instrumental in bringing a killer to justice. "You saved so many people," she'd said while reviewing her quarterly reports, "including that poor Margaret Henderson. She comes in here sometimes for arrangements, and she always mentions how grateful she is that you discovered the truth in time." The ripple effects of David's arrest had extended far beyond his immediate victims. Other financial advisors in the area had faced increased scrutiny from regulators, leading to the discovery of additional fraud cases that might otherwise have gone undetected. The entire industry had been forced to implement stronger oversight, procedures to prevent similar conspiracies. Brian's insurance company had faced massive lawsuits from families of the 8 murdered victims, ultimately paying out settlements that reflected the true value of the lives David's network had taken. The company had also fired several executives who'd failed to detect the pattern of suspicious claims Brian had been approving. Summit Financial Group had collapsed within months of David's arrest, as clients fled and regulators discovered that the corruption extended beyond David's individual crimes. The firm's other advisors had struggled to find new employment, their reputations tainted by association with David's network. Justice had been served, but it had come at a tremendous cost to everyone involved. 8 innocent people had died before I'd discovered David's crimes. Dozens of families had been devastated by both the murders and the financial fraud. An entire community had been shaken by the revelation that respected professionals had been systematically killing vulnerable clients. Yet there was also hope in the aftermath. Margaret Henderson was alive because I'd acted on my suspicions. Regulatory reforms would protect future potential victims. The criminal network had been completely dismantled, preventing any additional murders. And I had reclaimed my life from someone who'd tried to steal it from me. Every morning I woke up in my cottage, every case I solved, every victim I helped, was a victory over David's attempt to silence me permanently. The woman who'd overheard her husband planning her murder down the stairs had become the woman who'd sent him to prison for life. The prey had become the predator, and justice had prevailed over evil. As I sat in my home office one evening, reviewing files for a new case involving suspected financial elder abuse, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed. 6 months ago, I'd been living a lie with a man who'd planned to kill me. Now I was using my skills to protect other vulnerable people from predators like David. The work was challenging, but it gave my life a purpose that felt genuine for the first time in years. I was no longer playing a role or hiding parts of my identity to fit someone else's expectations. I was exactly who I was meant to be, a forensic accountant who used her skills to fight financial crime and protect vulnerable victims. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Park, asking if I'd be available to consult on a new case involving suspicious insurance claims in Nevada. I smiled as I typed my reply, confirming my availability and requesting the case files. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries to solve, and new opportunities to prevent other families from experiencing what I'd endured. David had tried to end my story on his terms, but instead he'd helped me write a new chapter that was entirely my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.